Hey, how's it going? I want to talk a little bit more about project number two and about the prompt. I imagine that thus far, project number two is pretty straightforward. Well, I imagine you've at least selected a discourse and you've thought about the characteristics and the patterns and the values and all of that good stuff that you can see in the discourse. In other words, I hope that you took a look at my video from last week about the prompt, because I now want to talk a little bit about the prompt again, except now I want to concentrate on numbers 5 and 6. You'll remember that last week I explained 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, now let's have a little bit more fun. So in the prompt, I'm asking you to, at the end of your paper, consider those values, attitudes, and ideologies in your discourse and think about them in light of the larger culture, and then draw some interesting conclusions. So let me give you a brief lecture about what all that entails. And this lecture I like to call a super quick overview of thinking about discourse as power. Here we go. Now, I want to make 4 points. And the first point I want to make is this. When you think about discourse, or you think about language, I want to try to shift our thinking from thinking about language as being correct or incorrect, and instead start thinking about language as having a certain amount of power. So here's a little example that I hope clarifies. If we look at these two sentences here, we can see that the first sentence says, he has been married. And we consider that standard American English, right? He has been married, the grammar is correct, right? At least that's the premise. And if we contrast that with he been married, right? Many of us would say, well, in that second example, the grammar is incorrect, or that would be the premise. But this second example is actually an example of African American vernacular English. And so the point that I'm making is it is not as if this first one is correct and the second one is incorrect. In fact, we can shift our thinking and we can say that what we really have here are two different dialects. And this first dialect, the standard American or academic English dialect, has far more power than the second dialect. So it's not that this one is right and this one is wrong. It's that this one is far more popular. This dialect of English is far more popular and therefore has far more power. This dialect of English isn't as popular and therefore doesn't have as much power. And so we're shifting our thinking from correct, incorrect, and we're now thinking of the level of power that different ways of speaking have. I'll come back to this point. The second point I want to make is that the discourses that we use at certain points in time change. And so if you look, I've given you two examples here. This first example is the sort of language that we would find in a presidential inaugural address at the end of the 18th century. And so it's from George Washington. And he writes this: among the vicissitudes incident to life, no event could have filled me with greater anxieties than that of which the notification was transmitted by your order and received on the 14th day of the present month. That is very confusing. We can contrast that to the sorts of language that were used in presidential addresses in the 20th century. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. These are both examples of presidential discourse, except we can see that one is far more complex and was presidential discourse many moons ago, and the other is far simpler and is actually far more akin to the sorts of presidential discourse we see today. And so, though they occupy the same position, presidential discourse, there's actually been a change, right, and what that means over time. Third point I'd like to make is that we can think of discourses in the culture as fitting into a certain hierarchy. And that goes back to that idea that I had mentioned earlier about popularity, about being popular or unpopular, or about thinking of discourse in terms of the amount of power that it has. And the easy way of understanding this is to think that there are some dominant discourses, and as we move down the hierarchy, there are more marginalized discourses. And so I gave you guys a reading in one of the potential discussions that talked about this a bit, but the idea is basically as follows. If you think about dominant discourses, we can think about the dominant institutions in the culture, those big institutions that exist, the institutions of higher education, of law, of media, business, the military, even sports, I would argue. And that there's certain ways of communicating in these big dominant discourses or these big institutions. And so I give you just a couple of the types of values or ideologies that we see here. Rationality, right, is held in very high esteem. The communication is very direct. The communication is often adversarial or argumentative. We can think of law, we can think of media, Fox versus MSNBC. Um, it's very competitive. Think of sports. There's often only two sides. Credibility plays a very big role. I put this $ here because it alludes to what happens in the discourse of business, right? That the customer is always right, that the idea is to make the sale. Right? Well, that's a value that's embedded in there. And I put here that there are masculinized communication practices. And again, that connects to one of those articles in our discussions. And so we can contrast that with this sort of thinking here, the marginalized discourses. And I gave you some of those values. It's emotionally based, it's about compromise, aesthetics, non-Western ways of knowing. We could call that the feminized communication practices. And I've given you a couple of examples. Think of conversations about faith, or counseling, or yoga, or alternative medicine. Or when I mentioned the aesthetics, think about arts education and the role arts education plays versus the role science education plays, for example. Think about LGBTQIA or self-help, right? These discourses obviously exist, but they don't exert or have as much power as these larger institutions here. And so the thinking is that these values and ideologies hold more weight than these values and ideologies. And so now we're thinking again, not about issues of rightness or wrongness, but about the power that exists in the specific discourses that we use. And what's interesting, and my final point, is this. Because discourses can change, and because we can think about them in a hierarchy, then discourses can actually move around in that very hierarchy. And so they can become more powerful, or even potentially less powerful. But here are some three kind of everyday examples that I hope illustrate that point. You could think, for example, about Indian yoga versus American yoga. And if we were to think about Indian yoga and our culture as it's practiced in India, it probably wouldn't have a lot of power in terms of that discourse. Because in the Indian version of yoga, there's a lot of issues that are almost religious. Whereas in the American version of yoga, there's actually a lot of those $. You can think of those Lululemon pants, right? You can think about paying for classes. And so these two discourses are actually very different discourses. And this version, right, that originally comes to the United States undergoes a transformation, right? That those dominant discourses start to play a role, and yoga as a discourse is fundamentally altered. And so it changes in terms of how it works in the US. You could think of little examples too, like surfing, right? There's very popular competitive surfing. Right? That's what this little picture illustrates here. And in this case, we can see how there's sponsorship involved. There's those $ again. We can see that it's all about the competition. It's about winning contests. But we could contrast that with a much different way of understanding surfing, right? There's that whole kind of quote unquote soul surfing, the connection to nature, the spiritual surfing. Well, these two are much different. This one, right, uses or borrows from those values and ideologies that are much higher in that hierarchy. This one, of course, borrows some of those values and ideologies that are lower in the hierarchy, right? Or one way of thinking about it is that surfing was originally like this, but as it got brought into the culture, it changed and became this, because this is how things become popular. Right? We could apply that same sort of thinking to something like the mom and pop coffee shop and Starbucks. That, yeah, we're talking about coffee in both cases, but the actual discourses operate differently. And of course, this discourse has far more power than this one. And so I share all of this, right? I share these 4 points with you because I want you to now think of your discourse not as just here are the values and ideologies of how people speak in this certain community, but I want you to think of your discourse as being a part of the larger culture. And so it relates to other discourses, it uses certain values and ideologies from other discourses, and that's the sort of thing I'm asking you to consider when you look at 5 and 6 now. right? So when you examine your discourse and you start to come to those conclusions in the first part of your paper, I then want you to take that stuff and consider your discourse in light of the larger culture. I hope that gives you some insight. If you have any questions, let me know. Take care.